Heggenes from Concordia. I am just going to say 30 seconds on how proud we are today to host the private sector forum on migration and refugees in cooperation with so many illustrious groups. We're really honored to be able to have an impact on this critical issue, and I think our partners have created a program that will really sort of come at this issue from a lot of different sides and will hopefully result in some concrete actions being taken. So thank you to everyone, especially to Greg Maniatis, who initially had this idea to work with Concordia and has worked tirelessly to get this done. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Michael Doyle of Columbia University, who will take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Let me begin by again offering my thanks for the co-sponsorship of UNHCR and IOM, Karen Abu Zaid's office at the UN, George Soros, especially for starting us off with such a bang this morning with his major announcement and his Open Society funds, and of course the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation. And to state the obvious, we thank as well Concordia and Nick Ligothidis. They are the rock on which we're building this private sector forum. I want to particularly also thank and mention that this would not be taking place without what I would call the organizing genius of Gregory Maniatis and Alex Alenikov. This is taking place because of them. They put all of this together. But it also wouldn't take place without the indefatigable attention to detail of Maggie Powers, Cato Van Broekhoven, and Emma Borgnes of the Columbia Global Policy Initiative. And we will be also recognizing and thanking the various moderators as we go on today. Our topic is the role of the private sector, by which we have an expansive definition. We mean corporations, foundations, NGOs, individuals, civil society in the broadest sense of that term. And our message is that the private sector has a vital role to play in assisting refugees and vulnerable migrants. It is the proverbial third leg on the stool that also includes international organizations and states. Yesterday, international organizations, the General Assembly, affirmed an outcome document that stood foursquare behind the 1951 Refugee Convention and defended the key principles of asylum for refugees, principles that have come under attack in parts of the world today. And they reiterated a commitment made in the Sustainable Development Goals to make migration safe, orderly, and regular. Well, valuable as that was, and it was valuable, it was short on specific and actionable solutions to the largest crisis of displacement since World War II, the 65 and some million displaced in the world today. And then when we turn to states, this afternoon in President Obama's summit, the U.S. and various other states and corporations will make valuable pledges to provide concrete assistance to refugees with $3 billion of additional funding, doubling of resettlement numbers, and increasing access to education for 1 million youngsters. Again, wonderful as this is, it will not add up to the manifest unmet needs of the world's 21 million refugees and 3 million plus asylum seekers. The wider private sector assembled here today is that vital third leg of the stool that will allow a stand-up performance for the world community. Now, no one is suggesting that the private sector can achieve this on its own. Multilateral action and states are, of course, vital. But if refugees and vulnerable migrants are to recover lives of dignity, self-reliance, and productivity, if the communities that host them are going to thrive, then new models of operation, new business models of action are needed to share responsibility and provide assistance and empower the refugees and the communities that shelter them. And this is a task the private sector, broadly considered, in my opinion, must step up to help deliver. Today, we are searching for these new models in the conversation throughout today and actionable commitments to make a difference. In 6 panels, they include philanthropy, connectivity, the private sector role in resettlement, private investment in refugee hosting areas, skills matching for refugees and employers, and a changed narrative to change the perception to closer to reality for refugees and migrants. So that's our plan. It's ambitious. I count upon all of your participation today to make this happen so that we can deliver to those who definitely need our assistance. A few housekeeping items before we move to our first panel on philanthropy. We're going to be engaged in conversations in these panels, not set speeches. We have some designated speakers with whom we will start, and then we will open up for comments or questions from participants throughout the room. We will ask those seated at the table to raise their placard right here if you would like to speak. Those in the back can attract the attention by waving for a handheld mic. Please limit any contribution to 2 minutes or less. We are very tight on time. And so I will hope you will accept my profound apologies if in the course of this morning I cut you off. We're on a very tight schedule. For the same reason, no one this morning will get an adequate introduction, other than the very kind one I just received from Nick. But all of our bios are on the website, and you can look us up there. To be recognized on a particular point, and please mention, as I mentioned, put up your placard or raise your hand for the mic. And when you speak, identify yourself. We will need to do that for the streaming session. The entire session is being streamed, and so all of the public statements are on the record. There are also, you may see, a dozen or so industrious Columbia graduate students here in the room taking notes for a report that we plan to produce in the next few weeks. We'll give access to that on a website that could be connected and you could download it at some point. And lastly, there'll be a 5-minute break between some of the panels, except for this one and the next one. So let's turn to our first panel, philanthropy. I'd like to welcome 6 distinguished speakers who will start us off. They're Lina, Sergie, Attar, co-founder and CEO of the KARAM Foundation. Per Heggenes, CEO of the IKEA Foundation. Amed Khan, president of Paradigm Global Group and founder of Elpida Home. Jean Shein, global director of corporate social responsibility for Uniqlo USA. Florian Maganza, Europe, Middle East, and Africa lead at Google.org, and Sofia Kouvelaki, program officer of the Bodhisaki Foundation. In some previous communications, I posed 3 questions to them, and I'm going to ask them to start out very briefly on the first 2 questions. And I think I'm going to turn to the big companies first and then go to the foundations. The first 2 questions I posed is that we know that philanthropists write checks, thank goodness. That's an important activity. But they also do things that make a difference on the ground. So what I've asked them to do is give us a sense of what they're writing these checks for and what actions their foundation and the corporations they're a part of are engaged in to make a positive difference in the lives of refugees and vulnerable migrants, how they're changing the business model. That question is paired with another, where did this come from? To you, your foundation, your company, what were the motivators or drivers? Was this your customers, your employees, your founders, your own inspiration that drives you in this direction? And then I'm going to have a second wave of a last question to them before I open it up to discussion. What's the one lesson learned that you would convey to this group, including philanthropists here in the room, who might be tempted to imitate some of the wonderful work that you're doing? So let me first turn to Per Heggenes, Jean Shein, and Florian Maganza for your very succinct reactions to this particular question. What are you doing and where does it come from?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just quickly to your second question, we started working with UNHCR about 6 years ago, simply because we didn't see much activity from the private sector. We thought the private sector could make a difference, and at IKEA we like to do things differently, so we got involved with UNHCR and with some of the people sitting in the room today. That has emerged into a commitment which is yet about $200 million with 15 different partners in 10 countries. So this is for us a very important engagement, and clearly started long before the Syria crisis was on everyone's lips, because we thought we could make a difference here. Our focus is on 4 different areas, really. The most important area is driven out of the fact that we want to look at refugees as assets and not as beneficiaries. So put them to work, give them an opportunity to create a life for themselves, and prepare for a life outside our camps. So livelihood development, self-reliance has been key, driving the opportunities that we can find in the camp settings where we work, being it agriculture and irrigation, being it business development, microfinance, getting people focused and use their talents for what it's worth. Lots of talented refugees. Secondly, we put a lot of focus on education, because if we can't educate the many children who spent their entire childhood in camps, their future is not going to look very bright. So it's the focus goes from primary to secondary education, and not recently we even set up the first ever university campus in a refugee camp in Rwanda, which is an interesting project, which I hope we can replicate in other places. The third area is on the renewable energy. When I first came to a camp, I was amazed to see that after dark, it's absolutely dark in the camp. I thought that prevented a lot of opportunities for children to read, to do homework, for women to be safe, and so on and so forth. So we started the energy program with UNHCR, invested in capabilities so we can develop a strategy, and then started out with the low-hanging fruit, such as lanterns and street lights, now going into projects such as setting up a 6 megawatt solar power camp, solar power station in Jordan for the Attar camp that will provide energy for the entire camp. We also work on pay-as-you-go microgrid systems that provides energy for not only light but for small businesses. The last area is really on innovation. We feel that there's a lot of great ideas and great potential in this organization, being at UNHCR and others, but the innovation didn't come to the surface, so we helped set up an innovation unit within UNHCR to capitalize on those ideas and hopefully at some point change policy and change the way things are done so we can provide better quality for less money. And we also invested a lot of time and money in developing an alternative to tent, a shelter that provides better quality for the people and better economy for UNHCR. So that's basically it.
Great. Thank you very much. As I listen to you, it sounds like this is a venture briefing in Palo Alto. You are investing in refugees and in UNHCR. And I think that's a different way to do business than a very powerful one.
Yeah, well, we're not in the aid business. We are in the business of helping people to help themselves. And I like to use the word investment because it tells you that there's something coming out of it. But we're looking for social return, not financial return. Yeah,
that really came through very nicely. Thank you very much. I'd now turn to Jean Shein for his comments. Jean?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here. Our relationship started 10 years ago. Initially, it was not based on money. It was just based on clothing, which is what our company makes. And it started as a practical solution. We had a recycling program, and we needed to find a place to mechanism to distribute our clothes. And the UNHCR was one of the companies or one of the organizations that stepped up and agreed to work with us. That relationship has evolved after distributing about 20 million pieces of clothing over the past 10 years through in 62 countries, both in camps and non-camp situations, to include refugee hiring, which has started in Japan 2 years ago and is spread to several other countries and is something we're focused on going forward, to livelihoods, where we have worked with groups of refugees in Afghanistan and Malaysia and the Philippines to create products and sell them in our stores and stimulate awareness amongst our customers. And that is something we are looking to continue because it makes a really really brings the story to life when it's product related. And another thing that we have done starting in Japan is a program we call the Power of Clothing, which is an education program that is owned by our store managers who go to a local elementary or secondary school to talk about the refugees, generally speaking, and then incite the students to do their own clothing drive in their communities and communicate to who the recipients are and why they're doing this to their surrounding neighborhood. And we did this in about 300 schools in Japan last year, collecting several 100,000 pieces of clothing in a very intimate way. And we have rolled out this program to 6 other countries, and we're continuing to do that. So that's really the focus, in addition to a significant financial contribution to the UNHCR.
Thank you very much, Jean. The takeaway that I hear from your message is that you're building your philanthropy, changing the business model on your own business. That is, you're building out from clothing and finding ways in which clothing can engage refugees in helping to clothe themselves and mobilizing your customers around the world for changing the narrative. And I think that's a wonderful way to start.
That's correct. Everything we do is through our products wherever we can.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'd now like to turn to our colleague from Google, and that's Florian Maganza. Florian, the floor is yours.
So the way we do our philanthropy, because you were asking, what is your approach, and is it just writing a check? So our approach is really to fund innovation in the nonprofit sector, and we give about 100 million every year to nonprofits who are developing technologies that have social impact. But beyond that, it's important to us also to look into Google, what are the expertise that our employees have that they can bring to the table. And so specifically in the context of the refugee crisis, we have worked with a number of international organizations like International Rescue Committee. I'll give just an example of what we've done with them. One of the big issues in this refugee crisis was for refugees to have easy access on their smartphone to reliable information on registration, on access to medical facilities, etc. The problem is there wasn't such a place to go. So some of our engineers worked with the International Rescue Committee to develop like a low battery mobile website that was providing with this information. So this is really our model, and to Pierre's point, which I find really interesting, it is absolutely true that there is this a tremendous innovation within the nonprofit sector, which I think is a true untapped potential. And I think where we can come in is provide that funding specifically earmarked for that technology, because this is also core to what Google does. And on top of that, bring our expertise to the table and work in partnership with organizations.
Great. Again, thank you for those comments. Clearly a theme is emerging. That is, build on the business and regard this as venture innovation, that is fostering new business models to provide new forms of assistance to refugees and migrants that empowers them to help themselves. I mean, there's 2 very clear themes coming out in these comments, which is, I think, very powerful. Let's now turn to some of the foundations that are working directly with refugees around the world. And maybe I would ask Sofia from the Bodasaki Foundation to give us some comments about what this means to assist refugees, and particularly the special community that you and your foundation works with. Sofia, the floor is yours.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. Our team at the Bodasaki Foundation in Greece, at the forefront of refugee arrivals, started a program for the support, protection, empowerment, and social integration of unaccompanied minors. Unaccompanied minors are the kids that travel and arrive all alone in Greece and Europe, and they're exposed to all kinds of dangers, undertaking epic journeys that would intimidate even the bravest adult. At the moment, as we speak, there are 1,500 unaccompanied minors without a shelter in Greece, and this is only the official number. The real number is much larger because a lot of these kids go unidentified. They're spread all over the country. Some hundreds of them are in detention centers, and the rest are in the streets, exposed to child prostitution and organ trafficking. And the longer we leave these kids exposed, the further is their trauma and the harm that is done to them. So we decided to intervene. We created this program in a way that directly responds to the issues on the ground and gives voice to the kids. If a kid is not placed in a shelter, he or she cannot start to receive any kind of service. So our utmost priority at the moment is to create shelters that include all the appropriate services that would allow the social integration and the protection of these kids. So after 6 months of operation, we saw that solutions do exist, and we tried to create a positive community around the issue by raising awareness, by talking about it, because it's a hugely misunderstood and underreported problem. So we have created 2 new shelters. We are currently supporting 6 already existing shelters, because they have to be sustained as well. 30 foster families, so in total offering support to 320 kids. But still there are thousands of kids left unprotected. So we all need to support them. We need to end this circle of violence that starts when they flee from their countries, and then when they arrive to Europe, it continues. It's of utmost urgency that we all join forces, we create partnerships and collaboration to do something about these kids.
Thank you very much. You obviously, with the work that you're doing in your foundation, have directed your real commitment to the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, and that's extraordinarily important. You mentioned as well, I think, that you had statements from some of your assistees, those that you've been taking off the streets and helping to have a life. Would you mention one of them, maybe even if you could read a statement from them?
So before I left Athens, I spent some time with the first kids that were placed in the first shelter, and I asked them, what would they say to you if they were here today with us? So you can find their messages in Farsi, Urdu, and Arabic at the back of the room, but I've chosen one message. It's from from Ali. He's 12 years old. He's from Kandahar in Afghanistan. He was one of 5 brothers. He was considered to be the smartest and with the best potential. And he told me that he left his country, he left his home, because he wanted a chance to live and not just to survive. So these were his words to me. I have walked all the way to Turkey through the valleys, the mountains, and the deserts of 3 countries. After 4 months, I reached the coast. I had never seen so much water before. The small boat to Greece was full of people. Women and babies were crying. Thank God we arrived alive, but we were arrested by the police. I ended up in prison. It is hard when I think how many days I was there. What did I do wrong? I just want to be free, to be safe. I want to go to school, and when I grow up, I want to become an engineer. I want to build houses. Ali was detained with another 40 minors for more than 2 months in Amygdaleza, which is a refugee detention center in Greece. So we might be supporting now 321 kids, but there are still thousands that need support and protection and a chance to live, not just to survive.
Thank you, Sofia. Please tell this young man that his message was heard. Thank you. I'd now like to turn to Lina Attar from the KARAM Foundation to talk about the important work that she's doing.
And I'd like to remind everybody here that 5.5 years ago, there was not one single Syrian refugee. And that's a huge number of people, and more than that are currently displaced inside Syria. Our foundation, KARAM means generosity in Arabic, and when I co-founded it in 2007, it had actually nothing to do with Syria. It had to do with giving and how we can help support other organizations that were giving around the world. In 2011, when the crisis began in Syria and quickly turned into the largest humanitarian crisis of our lifetime, our organization had to change and focus on being on the ground in a conflict zone to deliver humanitarian aid and innovative education opportunities and programs for Syrian refugee kids. I think it's very important to know that the refugees change from year to year, from season to season, where they are geographically, and our programming must evolve with their changes and their needs. And so that's what KARAM Foundation does. We tailor our aid across Syria and for refugees to meet their needs. And two things that we're doing right now, we work in southern Turkey in Reyhanli, a border town with Syria, and we are building something called the KARAM House after working in this one town for over 3 years within refugee schools. The KARAM House is an innovation center for Syrian refugee teens, both boys and girls, for them to be able to access skills, mentorship, technology, and things that they could learn to either get them through to universities or to be able to learn skills to have a livelihood. And more importantly, it's a place for them to be teenagers, to be safe, and have access to surviving and recovering from their trauma. The second thing that we do in this town, and we've expanded to Istanbul, is our Sponsor a Syrian Refugee Family Program, which we began 1 year ago after Alan Kurdi, the toddler who drowned on a Turkish beach. We found many donors and many people were very passionate about refugees because of his viral image. And we developed a program that supports Syrian refugee families by giving them a monthly cash stipend on condition that they send their kids to school. And this way we're taking hundreds of Syrian children out of child labor and placing them back into school, investing in their futures, while at the same time alleviating the suffering of their families. And the program now has turned 1 year old. We just sponsored over 100 new children into our program. The children began school on Monday. Many of these kids have missed school for over 3 to 4 years, and they rode the school bus on Monday for the first time in their lives. And it's a huge success in that the families are able to move to better living conditions, and they're very proud of their children. And we've just began this program as well in Istanbul.
Thank you very much. Again, picking up on a theme that's been showing up time and time again amongst the speakers in this panel, that is, this is investing, this is empowering, educating is obviously the first way to do so. So thank you for those remarks. Amed Khan, I turn to you last, but not at all least. I have an idea of your thoughts. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Our effort is a little bit different. It's a private initiative. Me and a friend named Frank Justra surveyed the Greek situation. As Sofia mentioned, it's dire. There are 60 to 70,000 refugees within Greece. The large majority are living in hell on earth. Kids are playing in sewage. Little girls are being sexually assaulted. Little boys are being raped. The list goes on and on. There's human trafficking, there's organ trafficking, there's every kind of vice you can imagine. Now, hundreds of millions of dollars have been poured into this situation. The Greek government, the United Nations, NGOs, and yet this was still the situation after the survey that we did. So we said, this has got to stop. This is inexcusable. This cannot happen. So we set out to build our own center, and that's what we did. Where little kids could be safe, families could be safe, women could be safe from armed gangs, from mafia, from drug traffickers, from weapons traffickers. So at the end of May, we approached the Greek government and said, look, you're putting warehouses in tents and factories. You're putting tents in warehouses and factories. Give me one of these factories. I will repurpose the building. I will build it. I will make it humane and dignified. I will give someone a door that they can lock, a roof over their head, electricity, running water, a toilet. You can cook for yourself. And this is totally unknown in the Greek situation. And they somehow agreed. So we went ahead and built it. Within 5 weeks, we had completely repurposed an old abandoned jeans factory. And a week later, we moved people in. July 24th, we moved our first population in. And we are up and running and moving, and we do all the things that people dream about doing in these kind of situations because we have no bureaucracy. That's the joys of being a private philanthropist, I suppose. So we make decisions every day in moments, and it leads, we sort of have a flat management structure, so it lends itself to creativity. So we have on site all the things that Mr. Soros will be funding. We have creative industries, we have sewing cooperative, we have handicrafts, we have a carpentry workshop, and we've done this all within a couple months. And, ideally, we'd love to replicate this over and over and over again, and I think it can be scaled. Because what all of us as successful business people are good at is we're intellectually flexible, I hope. We have the ability to allocate capital efficiently and effectively, and that could be a problem with some larger institutions. And this is what's called for in this situation, because this is an emergency. There's no time to waste. I mean, every day that goes by, there's another little kid that's being raped or a little girl that's being lured into prostitution. So this is a very micro thing that I'm talking about here, but it's really urgent, and the bureaucracy stuff has just got to be pushed to the side.
Very much, Ahmed. For me, the message here is what a single individual can do. That's very, very important. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I realize I am, but I'll do it anyway. Can you give us some sense of how much this cost you to set up the Elpida home? You don't have to give it down to the dollar, but just give us a ballpark.
Well, I mean, I like to say that for $700 or $800, we can take someone out of hell and keep them safe for a year. That's how I like to frame it. Good. Is that all right?
That sounds great.
I mean, it's nonsense, right? It's $800. I mean, it's it's a dinner out in New York. It's unbelievable. I mean,
it's a dinner out in New York for some of us.
Well, I mean,
worth of groceries.
There are many restaurants in this city that are full of people spending $800 on dinner. I mean, I can just walk down the street to the vision test. So
that's exactly right. So thank you for that comment. Thank you very much. I'm going to pose one more question to the speakers who have spoken so far in a minute or two about the one lesson takeaway that they'd like to draw from their experience. But before I do so, I'd like to go to the participants here. So I'd like to take these three questions right here, comments to start with, beginning right there with the colleague on my right, your left of that trio. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. My name is Claire Woodcraft. I'm the CEO of Emirates Foundation. I should say Emirates Foundation is the national foundation of the country, nothing to do with the airline, and it's essentially a public-private partnership. And I raised my hand very early because I kind of took umbrage at your comment that foundations write checks. I would argue that in the last 10 years, there's been a very significant paradigm shift in the way foundations operate, and that I always say that the days of check writing are over, and I think we heard some excellent examples from your speakers of how indeed that's the case. I mean, we certainly run our foundation now as if it were a commercial organization, not because we want to create a profit, but we believe that the way you create commercial value and those principles can be applied to creating social value. So what we're hearing about, avoiding bureaucracy, looking at economies of scale, looking at measurability. Our programs are all run as social enterprises. So we have a program for emergency response for young Emiratis, where they have been mobilized into the field to support some of the refugees in the region. That program, SANID, which we're now looking to spin off with some help from our friends at Palladium, is run as a social enterprise, but is providing support to a social cause in the region. That model, we call it venture philanthropy. It's gaining traction in the region. The Middle East is very active now in talking about social enterprise, encouraging young people who have a very strong sense of social purpose to be engaged in philanthropy. So I really would argue that the days of check writing are over. We have our own corporate scorecard for the organization. So really trying to look at maximizing the output of philanthropic capital. And secondly, to the point of how philanthropic capital can help the situation of migration and refugees, we are working with Coutts on their $1 million donor report, which annually assesses philanthropic capital, which says there is around 24 billion, the last report, going in globally on an annual basis. From our region alone, there's around 800 million coming from the GCC countries. That's just what we know of publicly, which suggests actually that this sector is much bigger than that. Some people talk of it being $1 trillion sector, and we have Secretary Blinken talking about us needing around 20 billion for infrastructure in the region, and indeed Mr. Soros talking about 30 billion. So I think there's a huge potential for philanthropic capital when it is deployed efficiently to fill the gaps that are not being met through government funding. And finally, I would just add that it's critical that we work in partnership. So we were founding members of the OECD's foundation network, and also are the chair of the Arab Foundations Forum. With those two organizations, we are creating a youth coalition to see how we can scale up existing philanthropic initiatives that work in terms of job creation, because we believe if you're systemic, if you can create good jobs for people in the region, you can offset to some extent the longer term issue of migration. And I think in a nutshell, that's how the sector is changing.
Thank you very much. My comment about check writing was designed to be provocative, and it clearly succeeded so far. I'll turn to our next colleague right next to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Doyle. My name is ZIAD HAIDER. I'm with the State Department, and I serve as our special representative for commercial and business affairs. In that capacity, I just wanted to make a brief intervention regarding the roundtable you alluded to that the President will be hosting with a number of U.S. companies that have made commitments in this space. But before I do that, I think it's worth just explaining a little bit about why is it that someone at the State Department is sitting talking to business about this issue versus it happening sort of organically through the leadership around this table. And I think the fact is that even as we were planning for the Leaders Summit that'll happen later this afternoon, the recognition was pretty clear that a crisis of this scale requires all hands on deck. Number two, a crisis of this scale is displacing people with tremendous talent and skills, and to not find a way to tap that would be, as one refugee shared with me, complete brain waste right here in the United States and overseas. And lastly is the fundamental reality that the nature of displacement is such that people are away from their homes for decades. I think the average period now is 37 years. And so if there is going to be a solution to the crisis, it's a long-term one of integration, and that's where the private sector has to come into play. So in June, the White House led a call to action, or issued a call to action to the private sector, where we asked the private sector to really think about making contributions in three categories of areas: employment, education, and a broader category of enablement. And the culmination of that is the meeting that'll be happening this afternoon that the President will be hosting. And in tandem with that, 51 U.S. companies have stepped forward across our economy and across Fortune 500 to tech companies to SMEs and announced commitments. And just very briefly, the numbers I think are revealing, but I will immediately put them in proportion to the challenge. So we have 51 companies that have announced about $700 million in commitments, education opportunities for more than 80,000 refugees to include digital content, mentorship, and classroom support, employment opportunities for more than 220,000 refugees, including, again, training, internships, and job placements, and then partnerships between the private sector and 70 refugee-serving NGOs. I think what's more colorful, frankly, is the stories, and I think the employment one is the one that's of most interest to me, because we tend to think of this in these clunky terms of companies must hire refugees, end of story. And it's not so. We have to be creative, and we have to leverage the business models that companies have. So, for example, LinkedIn is doing a great service in the employment space, not so much just by hiring refugees, but providing a database to match their skills with employers. In the education space, Coursera is not just giving, classes online access, but is providing grants to NGOs such that they can access, in turn, help refugees access online training programs. And I think the enablement category is particularly interesting because it really does test the creativity of a lot of companies. And so you have everything from UPS announcing delivery of services benefits, to Airbnb providing temporary housing, to MasterCard providing prepaid debit cards, and so on. So we're delighted with the outcome, but I think, Michael, you gave us the right word of caution at the beginning to say that the scale is so huge that these are just drops in the bucket. Let me then just end by saying, how do we keep this going? 51 companies from our end have stepped forward, and we're not the only ones. Companies across Europe are stepping forward as well. And I think a couple of the lessons that I've taken away from this process is, number one, some companies don't intrinsically get the idea of playing in this space. I think a lot of the companies around here are enlightened in that sense, but a lot of companies say, we don't get this yet. What does this have to do with us? And so I think being able to speak both to the kind of clear philanthropic dimension of this, but also the return on investment piece is important. That dichotomy does matter to some companies. When they move from the foundation up to the C-suite level, their CEOs don't always nod and say, we've got to do this. There's some degree of persuasion that has to happen. I think the second takeaway is leeway for creativity. For a lot of companies, we had to do a lot of conversations where we would say, you may not think it, but this service that you provide, if tailored in this way at such and such circumstance, could yield real dividends. So working the problem is, I think, important with companies. And then lastly, what I would say that I think was useful that we tried to set up was a coordination mechanism, because all the parties around this table are doing great work. But how do you ensure that the person next to you isn't doing something similar? So what we tried to set up was a partnership for refugees, which consists of Accenture as a corporate partner, the State Department, USA for UNHCR, to be the coordination mechanism. And that allowed companies, as they were making commitments, to find out, well, what are others doing? And I think finding some way to continue that process, and in my ideal world, having the private sector coordination mechanism in the US, talking to such a mechanism, which already exists in Germany actually, talking to one in France, that degree, a network of coordination mechanisms is going to be important if this is going to have an independent life driven by the private sector itself. So let me just stop there and say there's a great deal more to be done, but I think the 51 companies from our end that have stepped forward are hopefully going to set a positive example for others to follow.
Great. Thank you very much, ZIAD. I can speak for a moment as a U.S. citizen to say how proud I am that the President has stepped up in a way to organize this Leaders Summit and bring corporations and states together to make a concrete difference. Thank you. I'll take the person just to your right, and then I'm going to come back to, and one other person to your left, and then I'm going to come back to the panel here to give them each 30 seconds for one lesson that you would want to convey to this group for those who might be inspired to step up in the ways that you have. So our colleague right there, and I apologize to others who have their placards up because of time factors. Please.
Hi, well, thanks very much. I'm Michelle Leighton, the Chief of the Labor Migration Area for International Labor Organization. I'm very interested in the panelist discussion this morning, and I find it very interesting. To follow on Zaid's last comment, I mean, I would take this a step deeper. We are working with a number of governments who are affected by the refugee crisis to deal with employment creation, which is a real problem. First, there's the issue of access to work, because refugees in many countries do not have access to employment opportunities. The second is, once they have access, what are their skills and how do you do skills and jobs matching? And then after that, the question is, how do you actually help them through vocational training or elsewhere to really meet their full potential, so that when they go back home, or there is some hope that they will go back home, they'll be able to help rebuild their countries. So we have a very long-term view of the need for assistance with refugees, and working in Turkey and Jordan, we're bringing groups together at the local level, which is sometimes very challenging, but that involve business, that involve workers' organizations and local authorities. But they meet a lot of challenges. And one of them is the business community in the countries affected is not always aware of how to get involved or engaged. And there isn't, so while there may be 51 companies in the United States willing to engage, there's a real challenge for business in the countries, Turkey, Jordan, but not just there. Also, most of the refugees in the world are in Africa. Most of the people of concern to UNHCR are Africa. So I'd be interested in how business, around this table anyway, sees itself getting engaged in those countries which are not perhaps, I don't want to say the flavor of the month, but I mean, the Syrian refugee crisis is huge, but it's not the biggest refugee crisis. Right. So there's a lot that can be done, but what would business see as their ability to get engaged with helping train businesses or invest in businesses in those other countries? Thank you.
Thank you again for those remarks. You may not be aware, but you're teeing up another panel that we have later this afternoon, which will talk about private investment in refugee supporting areas, and I'm hoping for a much fuller discussion there at this point, but thank you for putting that right on the agenda. I'm going to turn to our colleague here, just right there, and then I'm going to come back to my panel for lessons learned. Yes, please, thank you.
Hi, I'm Nancy Lindborg with the United States Institute of Peace, and my question actually follows very closely on Michelle's, which is the importance of enabling people to stay in their home countries. And Afghanistan, Somalia, and Syria account for about half of the world's refugees. some of those countries are trying very hard to emerge from conflict, and there are local businesses and an emerging private sector. And my question is, have you given thought to the possibility of investing in those countries so that there is the potential to create jobs and enable people to not have to leave their countries?
Great. Thank you for that point. I'm going to now go right down the panel in the same order that we began. Very, very briefly, lessons learned, and then an answer to Ms. Lindborg's question. Per, could you start us off?
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick comment. The majority of investments we make are in Africa and Asia, and not in Syria and the surrounding countries. But we've stepped up the surrounding countries in Syria because the need is significant there. But the majority of the investment is in countries that you normally don't read about in the papers. Lessons learned, lots of interesting lessons learned. I'll bring up one lesson which I think is absolutely significant. When business meets the UN, or business meets the UN, the NGO sector, you need to give yourself time to get to understand the different cultures, the different dynamics that happen in those organizations. There's not one good and one bad dynamic. There are different dynamics, and if you don't take the time to invest in understanding that, you're not going to get much done.
Thank you for that. As a former UN official who oversaw the Global Compact, I was hoping to be an interpreter for all of those conversations that you're talking about a number of years ago. Let me now turn to Jean.
One of the lessons that we learned is that you need to be very careful when you're communicating with your customers, because they can easily conflate issues, and that can cause problems and misunderstandings. So we've had to, or we are simplifying how we communicate and relying more on, I think we've learned that here, the human stories are much more powerful, and when you are trying to communicate or raise awareness around this particular issue, as opposed to going into a deeper conversation, or yeah, that's basically simplifying.
That's very important. You know, the businesses that rely upon their customers have to listen to them, but there's also an educational role that I've heard you talk about, and that's very, very important. Let me now turn to Florian.
So I guess I want to reiterate what I said in the beginning. I think one thing we learned is the value of collaboration between the private sector and the NGO sector, and how the two can innovate together. And I think to the point that was raised about what is the private sector doing in other countries, our approach is not to look at a specific country, but rather what is the challenge and how can a specific piece of technology address that challenge. And in the field of education, for example, there's a number of NGOs who are working on autonomous learning via mobile, for example. And this obviously is very helpful in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis, but it is in the context of education in conflicts in general. Right. So this is the way I think we approach it.
I have a colleague at Columbia, a young economist who's working with Google on that in India right now, on the autonomous learning model. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Sofia right now.
So we've three elements can summarize the lessons that we have learned. Greece is a special case, and Amed mentioned some of the particular characteristics of the situation. But the three elements are empathy. As a foundation, we had to go on the ground. We couldn't do this program by being in our offices, so we're in constant contact with the kids themselves, but also with the people, our partners on the field. And this is very important to be able to observe the needs and design the most efficient and effective tools in order to address them. The second element is the creation of a positive community. So this program is much more than a fundraising platform. We're actually encouraging partnerships and collaboration. And the first shelter that we created is an example of partnerships, because in Athens, after so many years of financial crisis, a lot of buildings are not being used. And the owners try to find a way to pay the taxes. So we managed to find a private donor that gave us his buildings. We mobilized one of the biggest construction companies in Greece, and now we have a very good NGO that is going to operate the shelter. We managed to get media attention to that, so it's basically a platform that engages all the different stakeholders, be it private donors, media, public authorities, international organization, and everyone who cares to contribute to this issue. And the third element, and Amed mentioned it already, is operational efficiency. In Greece, we have no time to prolong this situation. The more we delay to doing something about the kids, the further is their trauma and the harm that is done for them. So solutions do exist, but we have to act fast, and we have to be very careful where to allocate the different resources.
Good. Thank you very much. Lina?
I think one of the most important lessons that we learned is to listen to the people on the ground and listen to the people that we serve and to the communities that we develop our programs for, because they constantly inspire us and help us change and evolve our programming to fit their needs. One of the things that happened with our innovative education programs is that we had several tracks of entrepreneurship, technology, language acquisition, access to higher education as things that we were focused on giving Syrian refugee teenagers. And we had a reporter with us from the New York Times who was there to report on the program, and the kids were surrounding her, and within a day we had set up a new workshop in the garden of the school with just a flip chart, and suddenly our journalism workshop began. And within 2 workshops that were 9 months apart, we have 4 Syrian refugee kids who moved from the border to Istanbul, first as journalism interns, and now they are full-time employed journalists at the ages between 19 and 21, and they never knew that they actually ever wanted to be journalists before they were introduced to this one journalist who inspired them as a mentor. So it's very important to listen. But the second thing I'd like to say is that there's a very important lesson unlearned here, is that we all here are investing in refugees, investing in innovative solutions, but the reality is for Syria is that genocide is happening in the country and people are being bombed every single day. Our schools, our bakeries, everything that we're investing in inside Syria gets constantly attacked by the Syrian regime and its allies. And to listen to, the Obama administration helping refugees and getting involved with the private sector is really wonderful. But at the same time, I think the international community has a much greater responsibility to end the conflict and end the bombing of the Syrian people, so that all of us, our investments can grow and we can end the crisis and help refugees return home, because ultimately that's their goal and that's their dream.
Thank you very much for that comment, Lina. Very important.
That's what I was going to say.
I think you were heard very, very well. If I could plug, there's a movie circulating called White Helmets, which is definitely worth watching. It's about Syrians who are trying to rescue other Syrians, a very powerful example of the message that Lina was sharing with us. Lastly, Amed.
The road to war is wide, but the road back home again is very, very narrow. We live this every single day. People are in despair. They miss their homes. And everybody should be discouraged from starting wars irresponsibly. And we're just dealing with the consequences of those wars. What I would say to private philanthropists or private foundations is you can play a great role. You can make a direct impact on a daily basis. With a little bit of patience, you can work with the UN Refugee Agency. You can work with NGOs, but you actually need to bring your skills and abilities also. You can implement, you can achieve amazing things. So I would encourage everybody with some resources and some time on their hands to get involved, to get actively involved, get their hands dirty, because this is a problem that's going to take everybody. We can't rely on governments, we can't rely on NGOs, and that's obviously proven. It needs everybody cooperating. So I'd say that it can be done, and I'd encourage anyone and everyone to get involved as quickly and as effectively as they possibly can.
Thank you very much. What I heard from this panel is build from the business, venture philanthropy, cooperate, no single no single institution has the answers. Empathy is essential and natural. We have to listen, and their human costs are so severe that dealing with consequences is the most costly way to help people. Getting at the causes are there, and bring your expertise to the table. And these are some of the themes I heard today, and please join me in thanking the panelists, everyone who spoke for that.